Greetings all the way from South Africa. I have a question for you. Tell me if this sounds familiar. When things are going well, or maybe when your results are strong, team is performing well, maybe business numbers are even up, do you feel like a great leader? Maybe walk differently, speaking with more confidence? Yeah, get to take up more space in the room. Now, what happens when maybe one project goes wrong, or maybe a relationship within the team breaks down, or perhaps a decision doesn't land the way you planned? Do you feel or find that suddenly that confidence perhaps evaporates? Perhaps maybe even start questioning whether you're actually cut out for, being a leader. Well, if that pattern sounds familiar, then I want to tell you something important today. You're not leading from your God-given identity. Sadly, it means you're leading from what I would call performance. And the problem with that is it doesn't just exhaust you, it will absolutely consume you. It will absolutely consume you and exhaust you like nothing you've ever experienced. It's like, when you build on sand, every leader who built on sand will eventually face a storm that reveals exactly what the foundation is made of. So, welcome again. Today, we draw the line between performance and identity. We're really going to have a conversation about what changes, perhaps in your decision, your resilience, your relationships, and your reach when you finally stop confusing the two. So, let's get right in. Performance is what you produce, and identity is who you are. They're not the same thing, but for many leaders, it's almost like, they've become so intertwined that it's almost impossible to separate them. Performance-based leadership ties your sense of self to your results. For example, when the results are good, you feel, hey, I'm worthy of my role. When performance or results are poor, perhaps you doubt your right to even be there. Your confidence is not an internal resource, it's a byproduct of your last outcome. Whereas identity-based leadership is completely different. Your foundation doesn't shift with the results. You can fail, whether privately or publicly, and actually recover quickly. Not because, you're indifferent to failure, but simply because your sense of self, it has never been attached to, you know, your performance or outcomes in the first place. And that distinction matters enormously because any leader who leads from identity makes fundamentally very different decisions than the leader who's leading from a place of performance. So let's look at some contrast here. When you're leading, as a leader from a performance-based perspective, you'd often ask, hey, how will this make me look? Whereas a leader who's leading from, identity-based perspective would normally ask, is this the right thing to do? The performance-based leader needs validation sometimes even before she moves, whilst the identity-based leader just needs clarity and then she moves on. Again, the performance-based leader is exhausted like by constant management of how she is perceived. Whilst on the other hand, the identity-based leader is free because they have nothing to manage that she doesn't already own, right? When we look in the Bible, Galatians 1:10, it's, Paul is talking about, am I now seeking the approval of men or of God? And if I still trying to please men, then you wouldn't really be a true follower of Christ. So, Paul in this text or context is naming the performance trap with surgical precision, beg your pardon. The moment your leadership is organized around gaining approval, either maybe from your board, from your team, from your audience, perhaps, even the culture within the organization, It just means that you've handed that control of your leadership to other people. You're no longer leading, you're simply performing. The now woman leads for an audience of one, not to become unteachable or to ignore feedback. No, that's not what I'm saying. But because her foundation, her sense of self-worth, her right to be in that room, the conviction about who she is, who she's called to be, what, her leadership is not built on what others think of her or her results. And the same way, God doesn't evaluate you by your last quarter or your last, your faithfulness. And faithfulness is an identity issue. It's not based on how you perform, right? So if you think of builders normally, maybe they'll be you build homes, everything, every structural mostly well, all infrastructures are built by builders. So let's take two builders constructing identical houses side by side, the same size, same materials, same finish. From the outside, they are indistinguishable. Then, the storms of life will come. One house will stand and one will collapse. The difference isn't necessarily about the house, but the difference is very much about what was the house that, fell down when the storm came. What was it built on? What was the foundation like? So, same as when you see any beautiful house, whether it's a skyscraper, whatever it is, the foundations is crucial. Similarly, performance-based leadership is a beautiful house, albeit built on sand. Impressive, it's impressive in fair weather, but catastrophic when conditions change. Whilst identity-based leadership is the same house, however, though it's built on a rock. And so the storms cannot destroy it. It's simply when we all face, storms in our lives or challenges in our leadership, all it does is it simply reveals the foundation on which we're built. Okay, so when a leader operates from a performance-based identity, it's like the whole organization pays the price, not just, the leader, but everybody else around them. The decisions become a bit more risk averse, avoiding perhaps, being bold enough to make some moves sometimes publicly, because doing things publicly or making decisions publicly would often threaten her sense of self-worth because the fear of failure. Communication, I think, would also become managed, and would often be, you know, saying what in my experience would be received, well received rather than what actually needs to be heard. And then even in the area of developing other leaders or mentoring other people would become selective. Promotion, for example, would be, given to people who affirm her rather than actually maybe somebody who would challenge her to grow or the leader to grow. And I think perhaps the most damaging of all is that, such a leader will create a culture that mirrors them, a team that is leading from performance rather than, hey, we have a conviction about this is the direction we need to go. And it would just simply become a culture where looking good matters more than doing good, right? And the contrast with the identity-based leader is very, very clear. Decisions are made from values. And again, teaching the team to do the same thing as in making decisions from our values. Easy and able to absorb even criticism sometimes, and teaches the team that feedback is actually not a threat, right? Very confident and willing to develop others who can even be stronger, stronger leaders than, themselves. because they're not threatened by the growth of other people. They build organizations or businesses that actually last because they're rooted in something far deeper than results. Now, and I've got to tell you the story. I think most of us, almost everybody, would have heard about Abraham Lincoln. Now, he's widely considered as one of the greatest leaders in American history. But what is rarely discussed is how consistently he failed before and actually during his presidency as well. Both business failures, political failures, public ridicule, and a devastating civil war. Right, the assassination of close allies. His leadership, one can say was tested at every conceivable level. But what held him steady, though, was not, his results, because they were frequently poor anyway in the short term. But what held him steady was his sense of purpose and his values. And that is an identity that did not shift based on any of the outcomes. And, he once wrote that I'm not bound to win, but I'm bound to be true. That is real identity-based leadership, just in one sentence, bound to truth, not bound to people applauding you. Okay. So how then can you tell that you're leading from performance? Well, these bear in mind are not accusations, they're simply indicators, and honest indicators. I believe for any leader, some of the most valuable leadership tools you can ever have. And so, I want to encourage you to get a pen and paper and write these down. Your confidence level tracks almost directly with your most recent results. That is a cue. That is very much a sign that you're leading from performance. So when things go well, you feel like a leader. When it doesn't, like you feel like a fraud, right? Number two, one critical comment, maybe even from somebody whose opinion perhaps you don't even respect, can completely derail you, yeah, or derail your week. You find that you over-explain your decisions, perhaps to your team, simply because you feel, I really need them to understand and to approve. Number four, you find it genuinely difficult to celebrate other people's wins, perhaps when your own results are struggling a little bit, right? And then fourth, you avoid making, strong or bold decisions because it feels like you can't afford to be wrong publicly. The cost of your self-image to you is too high. And then finally, you've been in a role perhaps even for years, but you still feel like you're waiting for someone to give you the permission to fully occupy it. So if you recognize yourself in two or more of these, then this episode, today's podcast is not a coincidence. It's really an invitation for you. So sometimes, having had the opportunity of working with many leaders, I've come to realize that it's very easy to confuse performance with identity. And in some cases, it feels like it makes complete sense. So here is something I want you to understand before we go any further. That is, confusing performance with identity is not a character flaw. Yeah. It's almost entirely rational given just how some of us were raised. When you think about it, from childhood, we got, rewarded perhaps, but what got rewarded? Good grades, you're praised, poor grades. Maybe your parents were disappointed and they showed it on their faces. When you, displayed in your obedience in your behavior, you got approval. When you were a little bit defensive, sometimes there was rejection. Again, visible success, when we're successful, we're celebrated. And when we fail, sometimes we're hushed or managed or simply explained away, right? So we learn very early on in our lives that who we are and how we perform are the same things. Well, for example, the love, acceptance, and belonging are conditional on an output. So therefore, it's not surprising that many people, built their identity on their results, not because like, they're foolish or something, but because it simply worked. It kept us safe and it kept us connected to our family or, whoever adults these were. Now, the problem is that we bring that wiring, or we've brought that wiring into our leadership, and the stakes are much, much higher now. Um, when you think of Proverbs, 4:23, it talks about guarding your heart, above all, and the affections of your heart, because they affect all that you truly are. So I think it's really important that we pay attention to the welfare of our innermost being, or from where, you know, everything flows, the wellspring of life. So your innermost being is not your results. It's not last year's figures or your most recent review, even. It's the wellspring from which everything else flows. And so you have to guard it accordingly, right? So I believe that there are specific patterns that performance-based identity produces. Okay. And so I'm just going to share a few of those. You can write those down and then, let us know where do you think that, hey, perhaps I'm a little bit like that, or maybe I have, another leader in my team or somebody right? So here we go. Maybe you say you're confident in your leadership, but then you find that you have to rehearse conversations 3 times perhaps before you even had them, because in that moment you're managing uh, how you will be received, right? Another thought is leaders who would often say, hey, I'm secure in my identity, but then you might accept a fee or a role or a seat at the table that's well beneath the value of what you bring to the table, because you're not entirely sure that maybe you even have the right to ask for more, or increase your prices or something. Another pattern is when you would say that you've moved past a previous failure, but then oftentimes it's the first thing that your mind reaches for. Every time a new challenge, you're faced with a new challenge, your mind immediately reaches for that, past situations. Um, or this one is it's quite common, and that is, a leader will say, hey, I'm leading from, place of conviction. This is my conviction. However, though, both yourself and your team would notice that, like, your position in terms of how uh, how you're positioned basically changes depending on who's in the room. And these are not necessarily, surface issues. They are actually the fruit of a root problem. And the root is that your leadership is being run by an identity um, that it's not you and was never meant to be in charge. So I want you to take some time and reflect on these questions. Um, and then be honest with yourself as you are thinking through these questions. So, number one, where in your current leadership is your confidence most dependent on your results? And what does it tell you about your identity and what it's actually built on? Number two, when you experience a significant failure, how long does it take for your sense of self as a leader to recover? And what drives that recovery, right? Is it maybe the next, good thing, good result that happens? Or is it the truth of who God says you are? Number three, if your identity as a leader was completely secure, regardless of this week's results, or maybe, last month's figures, or last year's outcomes, what decisions would you make differently tomorrow? Now, I know that's a tough one. And the final question for reflection is, who in your leadership world are you performing for? And what would it mean? What would it take for you to stop? Right. So I know these are really tough questions to reflect on, but it's really important. If we're going to be leaders who are leading from a place of identity, then we have to be willing to sometimes look ourselves up in the mirror. And as always, every week I have some challenges for you. And I do hope that you are doing these, because if you're doing them, then you're definitely growing. So write down the last significant failure or setback that you experienced and answer this honestly. Did it change who you are, or did it only change what happened? Right. And you find the distinction between these two answers will tell you a lot more. Challenge number 2 is identify one decision you're currently delaying because you're managing how it will be perceived. Make that decision this week. Make it from a place of your values, your conviction, not how you're going to be perceived. Try that. And finally, write your identity statement as a leader. And we have already gone through that in a previous podcast episode, so you can find that as well. Your identity statement is not your job description. It's not about your achievements, or, your successes, or, titles, or whatever it is. Yeah. So you can complete it this way. As a leader, I am dash at my core, and I lead from dash. And when everything external is removed, what remains is. And then, check it on a daily basis. Really, really important. And some practical thoughts for us. The identity statement from today, write it, refine it, return to it daily if you need to. Put it somewhere that you'd see it before your first meeting, at any given time. And then secondly, when you receive any feedback or even criticism, pause before you respond. Ask yourself, is this threatening my performance, or do I feel threatened in my identity? The answer to would tell you everything about where you are building. 3, find one trusted person and share one area you know you've been leading from performance, because the truth is we all do. We all do at some point. And then, of course, as we're maturing, we, come out of that phase. So one trusted person, share the area in which you know you're leading from performance rather than your identity, and ask them to hold you accountable. Okay. And then final practical application is Galatians 1:10. Find it in different versions and read it at the start of each working day. And remind yourself that you're leading for the audience of one. Let that really become like the filter for your decisions. Now, I'm wearing these glasses because it helps me to see. But imagine, if I had a blue filter or green sweet wrapper or something, everything I look would take the form of that color. So it's important that our filter for the decisions that we make, both in our lives and in our leadership, is really leading for the audience of one. Okay, so some quotes to remember: performance is what you produce, and your identity is who you are. So stop letting one run the other. Okay. And a leader who needs applause to feel secure will always make decisions that protects the applause rather than making decisions that protects people. Now that's quite tragic if you think about it. And finally, I want to remind you, you are not your last result. You're not even your next target. You're the woman God designed before any of those things existed. So in final closing, some food for your thoughts. For this week, every great leader you have ever admired has been tested. And in those testing, some of the questions was never, can she produce results? Because results come and frankly, results go. But the questions always is, who is this leader? Who is she when the results are not there? Right? That is the question that determines your legacy, not what you've built, but who you were whilst you were building it. Not what you achieved, but what you held on to when sometimes there was no achievement, nowhere in sight. So the now woman is not defined by her last season. She's not diminished, by her last failure. She's not inflated by her last success. She's anchored in something that no one else can touch. And that anchor, that settled, unshakable sense of who she is the most powerful leadership tool you'll ever have as a now woman. So, in closing, if you stripped away every title, every result, every achievement, what would be left standing? Would you say you're worth someone worth investing in? So, if this episode has brought something alive in you, then come back to it. Come back to it. Listen to it. Share it with somebody and do something with it. Also, subscribe to the Now Woman podcast on whatever platform you're listening to it, so that you don't miss anything. And if this series is really helping your leadership, then I want to encourage you and ask you to even consider leaving a review because it helps others find this conversation. If you want to bring the Now Woman Leadership Framework to your organization, or maybe your team or your business or your conference, then do get in touch. And then share this episode with somebody else. Share with another leader. And next week, we're going to go even deeper. We're going to be talking about borrowed identity. And what I mean by that is the version of yourself that's been performing but belongs entirely somewhere else. And we're also going to talk about what it costs you to keep wearing it. So until next week, remember to lead from truth. You're not bound to win, but you're bound to be true. So stop letting results decide who you are. Until then, stay faithful, stay focused, and stay all in. And that's all for this week.